Should we go? Yeah. Nice to see you all. Thanks for joining us. I'll wait another minute so we can get more people coming in. As you can imagine, Zoom is always a bit slow, so participants come as Zoom accepts them to come. But for those who have already joined it, thanks for coming in. I'm delighted for us to be hosting this event. I have an excellent panel. I'm very excited to be, discussing about this topic. Today, we're going to be talking about responsible people analytics, understanding the regulatory landscape around these technologies. This event is hybrid, so it's always expect some minor issues sometimes around microphones and different things, but thank you all for dialing in. So I should possibly start. And just as for those who are here present, if you hear a fire alarm, just as Emre would say, run for your lives. That's the major advice, but you can literally go up the stairs and then on your left, you see the exit door and you can escape from the building. Okay, apart from this housekeeping, we're going to have a network drinks afterwards, so feel free to join us after the event for those who are present. For those who are online, unfortunately, no network drinks for you, but for some of you in the US right now, have a great day, start of the day. Cool. Again, today we're here to talk about responsible people analytics. I am your host, Adriano Koshiyama. I'm the co-founder of Holistic AI. Some of you may know me, but as a company, we basically enable companies to adopt AI with confidence. Our key solution helps companies adopt and deploy AI done in a safe, legal, and ethical manner. And we are very interested in this subject. We've been doing a lot of work in this space through different angles. And more recently, one of the key works that we do is this whole New York City bias audits. And we are very interested in the key regulatory change that is happening at the moment. So before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say why we're talking about this subject in the first place. I think I'm preaching to the converted, the ones here and the ones online. We have seen major changes on how people get sourced, how people get screened, how candidates get assessed. Everything changes. And over the last 5 to 10 years, that progress has been major and major over time. Some of you remember doing pencil-based testing. Nowadays, for some who are graduate recruiters joining a major company, you actually go through a whole video assessment and there's no one interviewing you. That's really a major shift if you think about the possibilities of technology and what has addressed it. But that's just one part. After you got into the workplace, there's also other technologies that are being used to track your performance, sometimes even to suggest if you should move roles or not, be promoted or not, influence on your bonus, your pay package, all kinds of things. So major changes. There's no AI taking over and making decisions by itself at this moment in time. I would say maybe Abi can fight against me on this subject in general, but but there's definitely a lot of automation taking place and substantially nudging the recruitment process. To talk about this subject, I'm delighted to have Dr. Abi, Dr. Emre Kazim, and I have Frida online. And I would like each one of them to introduce yourself. Can you go first, Abi?
Hi, my name's Abi Gilbert. I'm here from an organization called the Institute for the Future of Work. We are a research and development institute that looks at the changes that are happening to work and workers' rights in an age of increased use and adoption of machine learning and other AI-associated technologies. That's it from me.
Thanks. Thank you, Abi. Hi, I'm Emre Kazim. I'm co-founder and COO of Holistic AI. I'm a co-founder of the company along with Adriano Koshiyama. I'm not an engineer, but our love emerged in the computer science department of UCL. I actually have my background is in philosophy and moved into the ethics of algorithmic systems, and that's how we kind of got going.
Frida?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Frida Alim. I'm a data privacy attorney at the law firm Gunderson Dettmer, which is an international law firm headquartered in Silicon Valley that specializes in working with startups and venture capital funds on a range of compliance and corporate and IP matters. I'm a data privacy specialist, so I help clients with all things data privacy and security, which includes advising on how they can use, share data, and increasingly includes algorithmic accountability. So really excited to be part of this panel.
Nice. Thanks for dialing in, Frida. Before I go into the regulation, and I know that a lot of you are interested in very specific type of regulation. A lot of you dial in for that. Before I go into that subject, I just want to start with a bit more conceptual and thinking about the whole really landscape of people analytics and why are we interested in different forms of risk and why regulation is important because of those forms of risk. So I want to start with first, Abby, if you can tell us a little bit more about, for example, some interesting use cases you have seen of people analytics in the workforce, particularly, and which ones have you, thought about that is enabling in some respects people to do better work and improve their productivity, but at the same time, some are a bit more, no one uses the term creepy, but a bit more concerning and risky.
Sure. So I suppose firstly to say thanks for having me today. And I think it's really important to focus on this because work is somewhere where we spend most of our lives. So the relationships that we have there and the quality of work is something that's important to focus on and therefore important that regulators think about. And to come to, I suppose, your question around how we've seen things changing in the workplace, it's kind of helpful to organize thinking around that, around different types of automation and how this kind of current era represents different form of automation. So in previous waves of automation, it was kind of predominantly substitution. And the major opportunity of this, of course, when you can absolutely replace a role or a role within an organization, that is for productivity gains. Although there are other emancipatory things that you can do with work in that regard. But with cognitive automation and specifically its use in algorithmic management, there are other ways that value is being extracted, and this is often traded off and exchanged with kind of workers' rights. And I suppose to come to the use case examples that you were talking about, we did a major review of kind of the introduction of algorithmic management, which is what we normally associate with only being a phenomenon in the kind of gig economy, as it was being made ready and packaged for download into traditional businesses. So these connected worker platforms allow for these new forms of value creation to be deployed within kind of traditional businesses across all sectors of the economy. So algorithmic management is escaping the sort of gig economy and something that can now be used within a traditional business. And the kind of risks and opportunities that this present come with different types of automation. So for the first of which being a kind of intensification of work. So an algorithmic management system will schedule more activities for you to do in a day that generates a greater intensity of work, which can contribute to higher output, but then may have trade-offs with well-being and sort of psychosocial harms. Secondly, kind of, as I know that some of the team at Holistic AI have looked at, tacit knowledge elicitation and kind of forms of understanding how work processes are undertaken can mean that certain tasks within roles are taken on by the AI, and some of the decision making is, but a worker is given less discretion in their kind of daily practices. And then there's also huge potential for a reorganization of work when work can be predicted and scheduled in ways that can also change and alter contracts. So this could result in a workforce potentially, and you can see this very classically with the major platform providers transitioning towards self-employment models. Now that's been estimated to have a saving for some of those kind of businesses of 30% in expenditure on standard employment protections. But there's probably questions there around there are obviously regulatory questions there that are emerging in the national debate around how acceptable that is as a model going forward.
Oh, very interesting. I want to ask, because one thing that we hear a lot, and I've heard this from, actually was in this SIA event a couple of days ago, actually. And we were talking about the regulation of AI, and unfortunately, a lot of times we end up in this discussion. We tend to have a very negative perspective about it, in the sense that why we focus so much on the risks And typical case, for example, is candidate assessment. And what, for example, definitely there is some problems and issues that can emerge. But if Emre can use that case around what could be the benefits as well of using some automated process to assess candidates.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, Adriano, just in terms of really we got going, if you will, or the whole area really burgeoned as a result of some high profile cases of harm.
Yeah.
So there were all these cases of people using algorithms. One of the most famous ones was a particularly large company using algorithms to sift CVs, and they were being shown to be horribly biased. So if you didn't have a particular, let's say Anglo-Saxon name or a particular gender and so on, you just had pretty much no chance. But there was a kind of irony in the result, which is the reason why we were talking about it is because it was surfaced. It wasn't, and the reason why it was surfaced is because it was replicating the historical experience. The system was just trained on and replicating what had been done in the past. So we had a kind of ironic situation here where we were able to point to something as saying, hey, this is unfair. And then we were identifying that the algorithm was unfair. But actually what we're talking about is unfairness per se, unfairness in recruitment, let's say in that particular context. So another way of reading that situation is to say, actually, it's an opportunity. The thing about algorithms is that the algorithms are it's not intelligence. You know, it's automation. It's doing something else. And what's happening in these systems is that by doing it in such a naked way, we're surfacing the assumptions. It's becoming very explicit and very clear how these systems are working. So what one could argue that it wasn't like we were going from a situation where we had this wonderful, fair and just labor market and recruitment of individuals. So all of a sudden we had these horrible algorithms come along and start behaving in a atrocious way and have these horribly unfair results. So even though, so it's a kind of irony that we got going through these high profile cases of harm. Another example of it was the calculation, a recidivism calculation in the United States, the likelihood that you're going to reoffend. Again, horrible results, but horrible because that's how we've been doing it for a long time. So humanity is pretty much failed on the fairness front, if you will. And the use of these algorithms, really, it's either if we do it well, it's an opportunity, but at the minimum, at least it gives us an opportunity to surface the assumptions of these systems. So really, from my perspective, the big kind of interventions were, one, from an ethical perspective, the ubiquitous adoption of these systems. So Abby, you just surveyed and gave a landscape of how they're being used. Basically, they've been used all across the business, all across these different parts of, if you will, labor. And secondly, really, it's about the kind of fairness of these systems. Can we be confident that these systems are being, in two ways? One, they're performing in a way that we can think is defensible or justifiable. We didn't move these candidates forward because they lacked X experience. Seems reasonable. We didn't move these candidates forward because they had a certain kind of name. Doesn't seem reasonable. So that's the kind of the first thing. And really, it's just to be able to say, are they, what does it say about the nature of labor per se in the age of automation? So that's another kind of ethical question that I think probably that you focus much more on. So I think it's an opportunity. That's how I say. I hope it's done in that way. I hope we look back at this period and say, the advent of these algorithmic systems made it impossible to hide behind opaque and, if you will, just kind of hidden or cloaked processes.
Nice. I know that one of the things that usually happens, and we've seen this in other areas, is that when you have these high profile cases of harm, eventually regulation kicks in. So the legislators get very interested in doing something about. And you can imagine why, because of course, civil society, population, etc., wants a change to take place. And government is actually the major force over there. It's a big company, as some people would say, that controls a lot of other industries. And when government enters in a certain way and provides a sort of basis of regulation, in many cases can be enabling for some businesses, and sometimes can be seen other way around. I want to ask Frida, who is on the call, we know that there has been a major intervention, actually happened last year. The major piece of legislation is called the New York City Local Law 144. That's the official name. The unofficial name, some people are using the term New York City Bias Audit Legislation, bias audit mandates. There's different names that people use vernacularly. So Frida, can you give us a 101 on New York City Bias Audit Legislation, if possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Local Law 144, as you say, could have had a more creative name, but that's kind of what we have for now, was passed about a year ago, and it comes into effect on January 1st, so in just a couple of weeks. This is a city level law, so it amends the administrative code of New York, and it applies to employers or employment agencies that use automated decision tools to substantially assist or replace discretionary decision-making when it comes to candidates and determining whether to promote an existing employee. And I think it's worth noting that automated employment decision tools are very broadly defined in the law itself. So it includes any process derived from ML, data analytics, or AI that issues a simplified score, classification, or recommendation that's used to assist or replace discretionary decision-making for employment. And there are 4 key obligations in the law. The first one is that you have to conduct a bias audit no more than a year prior to using the tool. The second requirement is you then need to take the results of the bias audit and post it on your website. So it does need to be made publicly available for candidates and whoever that's, perusing your website to see. The third thing that the employer and employment agency needs to do is to provide a notice to the employee or the candidate at least 10 days prior to using the AADT with them, disclosing what sort of job qualifications are considered by the AADT and what sort of characteristics the AADT will look at. And then there are certain other written information that needs to be provided to the candidate on request. And finally, the entity has to allow the candidate to request an alternative process or accommodation. The law doesn't actually specify what that needs to look like, and there's still a little bit of uncertainty around that because the regulations have gone on to say that although you have to offer the process or accommodation, you actually don't need to provide it to the candidate. So it's a little bit unclear how that's going to shake out. And in terms of where we are with this law, as I mentioned, it is coming into effect on January 1st, pending perhaps the regulator weighing in to say that they'll delay enforcement. But we did receive draft regulations from the regulator. So essentially we have the law that has kind of the outline of what's required. And we now have draft regulations that provide a little bit more kind of meat on the bones of what this law is going to look like. But those regulations have been subject to a comment period, and we're waiting to see if the regulator is actually going to amend the regulations before finalizing them. So it's possible that they'll look a little bit different before the regulations are finalized.
Nice. Can I ask you, and I'll also ask some of the people in the panel as well, but can I ask you, there's, I would say, 2 or 3 major interesting parts of the legislation. One, I would like you to discuss more, which is the nature of the legislation, which is, even though it's talking about bias, it feels a lot like a transparency kind of legislation. And my feeling was because it's the Department of Work and Consumer Protection. Every time there's consumer protection, the solution tends to be transparency. That's the way to name. But why do you think there was this urge of the legislators to go for transparency as part of the legislation, such that some of the results have to be online, for example?
Yeah, I think it's part of a trend in the US to provide consumers with more information about, first, like how their information is used, what characteristics are looked like, the characteristics are being considered by the AADT, and then to make sure they understand kind of what the results of the AADT, tricky acronym, have been in the past. So I think this kind of transparency trend has been pretty prevalent in the US. We're going to talk a little bit later about what other privacy laws are that also talk about automated decision making. And even in that context, there is an emphasis placed on, actually providing candidates with information that can enable them to make a determination of like whether they actually want to use this employment agency and want to be subject to the AEDT. I'm sure that was part of the reasoning as to why information needs to be provided to the candidate upfront. And then, if they look at that information and decide, actually looking at these results, I have a concern about whether there's bias here, that candidate can then request to opt out of that process.
Nice. A second question for you is, I know a lot of people who have worked and still work in the assessment industry, and a lot of them have been conducting internal adverse impact analysis. Even though the legislation is mentioned the word bias, for a lot of those people, the term that they're more used to is the term adverse impact. But the interesting bit about the legislation is the need for a kind of independent auditor / seems like third-party auditor to come in and check those results. Can you comment a little bit more about this role of this third-party auditor and why this is such an important thing in this part of the legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the law itself, it just notes that the bias audit needs to be conducted by an independent auditor. Local law 144 doesn't have, information on the role that the independent auditor would play, like within the company, and whether it's permissible to have someone in the company actually fill that role. We did get the regulations about a month or two ago, and the regulations have some more information about the independent auditor. It actually has a definition for the auditor role, and it does specify that the independent auditor cannot be involved in development of the algorithm. So I think that poses some challenges to taking the position that, actually a company has somebody internally who can do the independent auditor role, because if they're then involved in, evaluating the algorithm and providing feedback, there's a question of whether, if that feedback is then taken into consideration and the algorithm is further developed, if that person is truly an independent auditor. And I know this is something that commenters have commented on in the comment letters. Some folks feel that actually we should be allowing companies to have someone internally fill this role, because there will be a lot of smaller companies that maybe don't have the resources to look elsewhere. There are also large companies that already have folks internally who are regularly looking at the algorithm and its performance, who maybe would be equipped to look at the algorithm and conduct the bias audit. So there are definitely arguments on both sides, and there's a lot of ambiguity still in the law. So we're waiting to see whether the regulator is actually going to clarify that definition in the final regulations. Nice.
Before I change the topic for the New York City, I just want to ask Abby to comment on what what you perceive about this legislation. I know it's in New York City. It's just a city level legislation, but it's actually quite specific, very outcome driven sort of legislation. Doesn't talk so much about the design of the system, considerations about it. It's all about impact ratios. It's all about numbers at the end of the day. What's your take about the legislation? What do you think is going to be the major impact and changes?
Well, I suppose, first of all, to say it's definitely a really progressive step, and more than we've seen so far in the kind of assurance discourses that have come out in the UK, where there's a recognition of the issue of bias. And I suppose it's quite interesting, that framing of bias. And I think this creates a connect with what Emre was saying around how this can do something transformational. So it kind of, I suppose, reflects this rational actor. All we need to do is fix some certain decisions in certain moments in time to be able to address inequalities, kind of understanding of the problem. Which is kind of this eternal presentism, really. But the things that drive people to have different outcomes are also wedded in historical patterns of behavior and resource, which is the reason why these systems continue to learn and reproduce these things in time. So I suppose it's really important to have the transparency there around how these decisions were reached, in order for people to both use their kind of rights under tort law in a UK context if something similarly was adopted. And also they're probably best placed to be able to detect whether or not something was a proxy for a particular protected characteristic in ways that potentially an employer or an auditor might not be able to.
Nice. Can I change subject, but I'll keep in the same subject because the talk today is about regulations. And some of you who will be watching and hear the audience are also interested in what's coming next. And there's plenty of things coming next. That's the truth. Next year, I think the activity on legislation regulation is going to be way bigger than what we experienced this year. And I want to start with Frida, because we know that there is something coming up in California. Could you comment more about this one, Frida? I know that it's very different. It's same spirit to New York, but different in its shape, right?
Yeah, so there have been some revisions proposed by the California Fair Employment and Housing Council to California's non-discrimination law to prohibit use of automated decisions that tend to screen out individuals in a protected class unless the selection criteria is shown to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. And there are some further requirements around record keeping. There's some prohibition on advertising these types of tools for an unlawful purpose. So it's a little bit different from New York City's law. These are still draft regulations, so we're waiting to see how it shakes out. In terms of automated decision-making, it's pretty similarly defined to New York City, but it does include some explicit examples. So if you are screening resumes for terms or patterns or using facial recognition to analyze expressions, that would be captured by that law. So that's one development that we're kind of keeping an eye out for. The other thing I wanted to mention is in January, there will be amendments to California's landmark privacy law, which has been the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's going to become the California Privacy Rights Act as of January 1st. And there are some key changes that will happen on January 1st. One is that the law is going to be applied to employees and candidates. So historically, we've had an exemption for employee and candidate data. There is a bill that was supposed to extend that exemption, and it failed to pass, which was very unexpected in the industry. So that law is going to apply to employee and candidate data. And one key requirement in that law is that individuals who are subject to automated decision-making that has certain impacts are allowed to opt out of that automated decision-making. And there are several other laws that are coming into effect in the US next year that have similar requirements, but that do have an exemption for employee and applicant data. So that's another area that we're kind of examining to see whether companies in this kind of employment and HR sphere are going to be needing to comply with those other privacy laws. But yeah, California has had a fair bit of development in this space specifically.
Nice. The second one, which is across the Atlantic, but very substantial piece of legislation, which will affect loads of multinationals that operate here and a lot of European companies as well, is something called the AIA, or sometimes people are calling the UAI Act. Major piece of legislation. Probably looks like coming in second semester next year. Worst case, early 2024. Really worst case, looks like. I want Emre to, if it's possible, to comment about this legislation. I know it targets more the developers of the technology. New York City was targeting more the users of the technology, even though it ended up affecting a lot of the developers itself as well, as a second order effect. But we know the UAI Act targets more the developers and of course the users too, but mostly the developers. Can you talk more about the UAI Act as well as the application on the subject that we are?
Sure. So the first thing to say is there's a big, let's say, digital regulation agenda in Europe that's been pushing through in Brussels. So we've already seen two massive pieces of legislation passed. One was the Digital Markets Act, and I think it's basically a way to address monopolies, tech monopolies, and you can imagine the kind of social and political consequences of that. And the second one is the Digital Services Act, which I think is probably more targeted at online harms. And within both legislations, but more specifically in the Digital Services Act, there's already calls to audit algorithms that detect harm and remove harm. So there's already, if you will, some legislation that's passed more general. But if you will, the big piece of legislation that's going to pass is the EU AI Act. So probably the best way of thinking about it is to think about it as the GDPR equivalent, but for AI. So just like GDPR became the kind of global de facto regulation for privacy and address data governance, the AI Act is hoping to become, or the EU hopes through the Brussels effect, that the AI Act is going to become the premier legislation for AI. So the first thing is that it's huge, it's massive. You start to see the way that they start talking about the legislation is about market unification and things like this. So really, it's a big, big grab. The second thing to talk about is that unlike the UK, which has taken a more sectorial approach, and I say this with a caveat because actually the legislation does go into sectors, the EU has taken a horizontal approach. So they've got a blanket piece of legislation for the use of algorithms writ large in industry, in government, and so on and so forth. Indeed, they even talk about the use of algorithms in research. So that's the second thing. It's a huge piece of legislation. It's a behemoth. The third thing is to say that the EU has taken a approach where they are, and this is maybe similar to New York City, they're concerned not with regulating a technology, but they're concerned with regulating the impact. So they've taken a risk-based approach, and there's 4 levels to it. The lowest level is just, let's say, medium and low risk systems, which they consider kind of benign. So they give an example of a system such as a spam detector that you use in an email service, and they would consider that to be a low risk system. In that context, the compliance concerns are that the deployer of that system has to provide some kind of transparency obligation, which is just notify that you're engaging with some kind of algorithm. Almost certainly, it's probably going to end up being a bit like a cookie consent. Something will pop up and you'll click. So the idea originally was that that kind of system would have been the majority system. But it's been very, very interesting because, and I'll talk about the first system is the systems that are banned. So I'm talking about the high risk system then the systems that are outright banned. Then there's these low and medium risk systems. The systems that are outright banned are 3 kinds. One is significant manipulation. So the use of algorithms to significantly manipulate people. That's basically a kind of, another kind of, if you will, I was going to use a more colloquial term, but a kind of middle finger, if you will, to a big tech in terms of some of the big online platforms. And lots of people being concerned about democratic manipulation and so on. The second group, the second banned use of algorithms is in remote biometric detection. So that's like scanning in the public square. I mean, it's kind of ironic because then they give an exception to law enforcement. And then the third system that's banned is social scoring. And that's really a signal to a kind of gesture towards China. The majority of the legislation is focused on high risk systems. So despite the fact that it's a horizontal piece of legislation that's covering a broad sector, they actually define high risk in 2 ways. The, let's say, more abstract definition of high risk is actually to talk about systems that have an impact on fundamental rights. But then a way to avoid, let's say, wriggling around that and to make it much more concrete, the more explicit way in which they describe high risk systems is actually by giving a list of high risk systems or contexts in which systems are used. So there, for example, they would say a high-risk system, it's by definition a high-risk system if it's being used in education, if it's being used in critical infrastructure, if it's being used in law enforcement, and importantly, very importantly for this conversation, employment. And actually, interestingly, there they cover all of the areas that you described. It's not just the recruitment side, it's the use of algorithms in labor, full stop. There now, the high risk systems, and this is where I think it does break away from the New York legislation and is actually much more stringent and much more significant, is that there are massive obligations on the deployer of the system, people using these systems to deploy them. But there's huge obligations on the developers of the systems. So you see these huge annexes where they've got templates for technical documentation. They talk about conformity assessments. There's discussion about third-party assessments. So you've got massive obligations, compliance obligations on the developer side and on the deployment side. So it's a huge piece of legislation. I think another area which will probably make a big difference, an area to show it, is that the New York City legislation, the penalties, the financial penalties are not too dear. I think really the damage it will do to a company is reputational, whereas the EU are going all in. They're talking about 6% of global turnover for non-compliance to this legislation. It's a very, that's what I meant by it being analogous to GDPR. So it's a huge piece of legislation. I think it's going to have a tremendous impact on this whole ecosystem. And really it's going to, the view is in Brussels that it will become the global de facto AI regulation.
Very interesting. One question before I go to Abby and ask for thinking about our discussion over here about people analytics, what the UK is doing. But before I go there, I just want to ask Frida about the some other legislation that are popping up in the US, Frida. Bit off the radar, but anything else that you'd like to bring on?
Yeah, I'll add that there are actually already 2 laws on the books that are in effect in the US. And so those laws are in Illinois and Maryland, and they're primarily around use of AI to analyze interviews, video interviews. And in that context, you need to obtain the candidate's consent to use AI to analyze, their gestures, their expressions. And you also have to provide the candidates with certain information about what's being evaluated. I don't think those laws have gained as much notoriety as New York City because they are so narrow. And I think comparatively, a lot fewer employers are actually using that type of technology to evaluate candidates, but those do exist. There's also been a lot of efforts at the federal level to regulate the use of AI. The Biden administration just came out with a Bill of Rights in October. It's non-binding, so it's just a set of guidance on rights that consumers should have. So the right to be protected from ineffective systems, the right to be protected from discrimination caused by algorithms, the right to be protected from abusive data practices via built-in protections. So it's basically a list of rights and kind of what the administration views as obligations that companies should have that are developing or deploying algorithms. So that's kind of on the guidance side. We've then also had some attempts at the federal level to pass a data privacy law. So far hasn't been completely successful. I think there's been a lot of pressure on Congress to actually pass a law because we have had several states now that have passed their own state level laws that apply to residents of those states, as I mentioned, some of which have language around automated decision making. So this has really put pressure on Congress to develop their own bill. So companies aren't having to deal with this patchwork of regulations and figuring out what applies and are there differences between these laws. So the hope is that Congress will put something out. What they have published has been interesting. I think there's been a lot of pushback because Congress would like to preempt all state laws, meaning they would like to replace state laws with their own federal privacy laws. But senators in states like California are really pushing back against that because they view that law as not really going far enough. So in any event, that's kind of an overview of where we are on congressional legislation. But what has been proposed does actually cover use of certain algorithms. And so obviously it's prohibiting use of algorithms that discriminate on the basis of a protected class. For certain covered entities, it requires that those entities conduct algorithmic assessments or design evaluations. And some of that documentation actually has to be provided to the Federal Trade Commission, which can then look at the documents and decide, does it look like this company is doing enough under the law? And is there a basis to enforce the law against that company or enforce another discrimination law? So that's kind of what's going on at the federal level. And if you're a company that's using algorithms in this space, in the employment space, I think that the challenge that we're going to see over the coming years is that there could be double jeopardy because companies are already required to comply with non-discrimination laws in the US. And what we're seeing now is another layer that companies have to be concerned about in these laws, because some of them are stating, which is already the case maybe under some federal laws, but use of the algorithm, if it's discriminatory, could violate, these new laws, but that same activity is also going to violate federal law. So you could have a situation where you have double liability under these laws. And then an additional layer that we haven't seen before that obviously we've been talking a lot about today is this new transparency requirement that's fairly new in these laws. The requirement to really explain to a candidate or to an employee what the AEDT is looking at.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And just to finalize this section, I'll open to Abby. to talk about, I know that we have a UK audience here. I know that someone lives in Paris. So we have also an attaché from France around. But apart from that, maybe can you talk more about the UK landscape, which is, we made a chart recently, like, and I don't say this in offense, we was basically a Venn diagram with 3 buckets: California, UAI Act, and New York City, to see which bits overlap. So such a great image. My joke with Emre was, where is UK in the image? You know, that's the circle missing. Can you comment more about this?
Well, before I do, I just want to second the shout out to the recent spate of holistic AI infographics on this space, which have just been generally very impressive. So wherever the comms team are in the audience, well done. So yeah, I suppose the UK is definitely beginning to look like a major laggard in terms of regulation in this space. If you were pro-regulation, the recent sort of like policy paper to the proposed AI white paper suggests that they're going to go with a kind of principles-based approach, which is interpreted by regulators, which I suppose increases uncertainty in the near term. We would and there's also proposed redactions to parts of GDPR, which would actually reduce some of the current obligations in terms of privacy requirements. And I suppose that's because the government recognises this as or sees this as a space of significant growth, and also it's clear from the differences that are happening in terms of approaches internationally that the best method isn't necessarily there yet in a regulatory context. Although, having said that, we would probably, as an organisation, feel that the kind of next way to best learn what would be the right approach is to pilot different mechanisms of doing this. And obviously there's a great work that's already done by you guys, and encouraging organizations that you work with wherever possible to be transparent about the outcomes of those processes is probably also really important for regulation. I think from the comparative perspective internationally, the California Workplace Technology Accountability Act is probably closest to what we would like to see implemented as a kind of method, which is a broader impact assessment against all aspects of good work rather than just bias. So thinking about this, but I suppose to link that to the debate that we've had around the nature of audits under the EU AI Act and the focus on the developer or the deployer of a system, really a kind of impact assessment architecture is needed, which spans the whole life cycle of a product. And that's why we particularly believe that it's important to do this in collaboration with workers within a workplace. That can also help to identify what the right normative baselines are, has an inbuilt monitoring infrastructure if you create that appropriately. So a kind of co-governance approach, which is closer in nature to the Spanish riders law, which suggests doing this with work councils, as opposed to the kind of disclosure of a general impact assessment, which is more present in the California model.
Nice. I want to move to the final subject, which is what organizations should do about things. I would say probably thinking from a very short-term point of view, and thinking about compliance and nothing like above and beyond compliance at this point in time. And maybe we can think about, some of you can maybe discuss something above, beyond, but starting with Frida, and thinking about New York City, Frida. And I know it's difficult to give advice to companies and organizations what to do. We know that there's a deadline coming. Any things you are sharing with your clients, or would you think would be a kind of safe approach? Any suggestions, anything that you can help people think about this whole environment at this point in time?
Sure. I should note this does not constitute legal advice, but I'm happy to share kind of some thoughts on what companies should be doing. I think the first one is obvious, think about whether you're in the scope of this new law. And as I mentioned, it applies to employers and employment agencies. If you're evaluating candidates for employment or promotion in New York City, still a lot of ambiguity as to the scope of that. What happens if you're evaluating a remote worker? That's not completely clear, but I think you should absolutely, be thinking about this law if you're evaluating folks in New York City or evaluating individuals for roles in New York City. Then you need to think about, are you an employer that's using technology provided by a third party, or are you that third party that's helping companies conduct the hiring? Because the tricky thing about this law is it applies to both companies, and you need to make sure that one of you is actually doing what's required under this law, so there isn't a gap. And there isn't the concept here of a deployer and a developer, which actually is a helpful construct to think about these algorithms. Here we just have the obligation placed on the employer and the employment agency. So if you're a company that's using an employment agency to conduct hiring or promotion activities, and there's some automation in that tool, you'll want to, consult with that agency and make sure that, one of you is complying with the obligations, or even both of you are complying with the obligations under this law. If not, you could be subject to some liability here. And it's worth noting that candidates have the right to directly enforce this law against the company. So, you could be in trouble with a New York City regulator. You could also have candidates or employees that are up for promotion bring a claim directly against you. So once you've kind of figured out, are you subject to this law and what are your obligations, then obviously you need to start working through all of the compliance responsibilities, which include conducting the bias audit. And I think what's very challenging for companies right now is that we don't have a final set of regulations, and this law comes into effect in a couple of weeks. So if you haven't started thinking about it and you are offering tools that you think could come within the scope of this broad definition of an automated employment decision-making tool, now is the time to think about that and start considering what solutions you could use to conduct this bias audit, noting that independent auditor may not, give you the grounds to use someone internal to fulfill that function. That's something you're also going to need to think about. And then obviously, once you've conducted the bias audit, you need to also start putting together the disclosures, making sure that's up on your website, and making sure that candidates have the information that they need. So I think there are still a lot of challenges with this law because there are so many unknowns. But certainly if you are a company offering a solution in the space, or an employer, using these sorts of automated tools, this should absolutely be on your radar at the moment.
Nice. I want to ask you both here on the panel. Always there's going to be regulation coming, and it can always be taking this very short-termist approach, always like catching up to things coming. But are there any think about really large enterprise here who have major budgets, and they can do a bit more planning of things ahead, even though sometimes they scramble as always. But what would be a good recommendation that could encapsulate not only New York City, but any kind of hedging strategy, if you could recommend you both here?
So I'll get going. I think probably the single most important thing is evidencing that you took this problem seriously. So it turns out when you get going in this space that actually having absolutely no idea what systems that you've procured, where they're being used, how they're being used, turns out it's not a good strategy for if you will, managing the risks of these kind of systems. And what we found when moving from, let's say, theory very much to practice is actually just having a good risk management process in place, understanding what's taking place in your business, what's taking place across how it's being used, etc. In fact, and I would maybe bleed it back in, even though it's not a straight compliance question, the way we're probably, even if you look at what the EU is doing, they're pretty much signaling, they're saying at a first instance, have you taken this thing seriously? Can you evidence that you've taken this thing seriously? Have you looked at this? Have you recorded? Have you got some kind of documents to show this? And then in this, probably, I think the first half of this decade is going to be pretty much based on that. And then towards the second half of this decade, we'll probably see codification of technical standards, best practice emerging, et cetera, et cetera. So the companies that that move now, if you will, are just, this thing is not a 1 year, 2 year thing. This is it. In a way, in a much broader sense, the question of automation is the question of this century. It's going to define, if you will, not just the kind of regulatory, but the broader social and political questions of our age. So it's really a kind of, do you really want to be burying your head in the sand? You got to take this seriously. This is it.
Nice. Abi.
It's difficult not to say the only thing that's coming to my head, which would be a kind of core recommendation at the Institute. We think that the best single fix for this would be for a kind of legally mandated good work algorithmic impact assessment. And the way that we would understand good work in that context is against the synthesis of fundamental social, economic, and human rights as they apply to the workplace. And that really those kind of intersections with these existing legal regimes, like Emre's really bang on to focus on having critical detection of risks. Already organizations, when they're designing work and changing work, should be thinking about the extent to which they're complying with these various legal regimes, and also aiming for good work in the design of those things. So creating architectures that encourage reflection against all of those items in order to promote good work, which would be the best outcome of a technological revolution, would be the way to do it.
Nice. Excellent. I think I'm just going to open for questions to the audience here and also to the audience online. And I'm going to kick off with one question online, which is basically the question that we pretty much addressed it. But I think that one is focusing on companies should do. Can I, but before, because we asked it already and we talked about this question already, I'll just wait for more questions. But I want to ask a question to the panelists. And I know that it is a problem that I've seen around. It is we sometimes are using the term algorithms, AI, AEDT, and there's all kinds of definitions. My joke is it has been lost in translation. EU Act has a definition of AI, and if you go to the US Bill of Rights, another definition of AI, OECD has a different definition of AI. It's just like all over the place, and then we use AEDT here. Why we are playing with? I'm a very technical person, so for me, language is very important. Why we are beating the bush and using AEDT sometimes AI, etc. Why we are playing this? I will just open for you, Richard, to comment.
I'll just get going because it's funny. When we started doing this in the academy, the first thing we used to do is a taxonomy of definitions and talking about exactly what you meant. Well, actually, I think it's a healthy thing that we completely flipped that problem on its head. Do you know what? In a way, it's not a engineering problem about defining the nature of machine learning. It's about the impact. If you're using a neural network to produce a word cloud for some kind of, to put in a marketing campaign, who cares? If you're using a glorified Excel sheet to rank candidates, then it matters. So I think it's a positive thing that we ended up, that in a way, the kind of the legislative or policy intervention, when people were saying, actually, what actually matters is the impact, the context in which these systems are being used. So effectively, because I've seen this debate, it's happening really in a really intense way in Brussels at the moment. But actually, I think it's actually a good thing that the definition that they're using is very broad and abstract, which is effectively some kind of automation, the automating of decisions, of discretion, and so on. So I think the reason why we're doing this is because actually it's novel, and there's a bleeding between the regulatory and policy bods and the kind of technical ones.
Can I go to Frida and ask Frida, because I know, Frida, you have a specialty on data. And data has been, for a while, way more regulated and way more specified. What's your views about it, and why, for example, in New York City, they use this term AEDT. And they, of course, make a list of what AEDT could be: AI, machine learning, data analytics, etc. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging with that definition because it is incredibly broad and they do have some carve-outs. But the carve-outs are not particularly helpful. It's like a spreadsheet, things that we wouldn't think of alone as being an AEDT. So I know this is something that companies are really going to struggle with. I agree with Emre that, the focus should be whether there is a significant impact on, rights or freedoms of folks. And I know the US has taken a very specific interest in employment. And if you look at the way, proposed federal legislation has been drafted, you see that the focus is also on like areas that, the federal government thinks is very important, such as, extensions of credit or, again, employment, education. So they're really zeroing in on areas that they think there will be a big impact. And I think that's the right direction to go rather than having an extremely broad law. So I do think, is it better to have a list of areas in which, the algorithm should be more regulated versus the approach that the EU is taking with having kind of this high risk category and banned category. I mean, I think it's a really interesting debate. I think we probably have gotten a little bit more clarity from the EU on what they consider to be high risk versus, low risk AI use cases. So I think that's in some cases more helpful, but we're still kind of waiting to see how these laws play out for the ones that haven't passed yet and for the ones that have passed and are coming into effect. There's still a lot of uncertainty because I guess another complicating factor that we have in the US is that we're very reliant on regulatory agencies drafting regulations. So, with the New York City law, we get the law itself, we get the text, but then we're dependent on the regulators to really sketch out what are the requirements that will actually apply when it comes into force.
Excellent. Audience, feel free to ask any questions. I have one here. Yeah, can you pass the microphone? Yes, someone in the front. Could you do a quick introduction as well?
Oh, absolutely right. Thank you very much. This is really, really interesting. So my name is Phoebe Moore. I'm based at the University of Essex, professor of future of work and management. I also lead a project for the International Labour Organization of the UN right now, which is exactly on regulating AI, which is kind of exciting. And I'm really excited to be here. Because these are some of, as you said, the most important questions of our time. So one thing I wanted to mention was just quickly in terms of and I should say Robert Donahue, who's sitting right next to me, is working on that with me. So it's great stuff. And yeah, we have a team of us. And so what I think we have quite a lot of discussion. I mean, we could be here for weeks. What I wanted to ask you and kind of in a way maybe challenge you a little bit on, because I am enthusiastic about the AI. I am, because it's the only one trying to do something from a hard law regulatory space and this kind of with the potential Brussels effect. I think that's interesting and important. And of course, we are entering the most important phase of that, which is going to be the trilogue discussion. So you have 3 different groups that have input and have been kind of grappling it out over the last, how many years is it now? 2 years now. Yeah. So the 2 things that you mentioned them, and they're, for me, the 2 most important things about that. And call into question the very fact that AI in and of itself, because of it being deep learning, machine learning, the kind of neural network, the very fact that there will be some unpredictability, and I'm talking to you as technical experts, where there's that that's what differentiates it. So then when we get to the point around scoring, whether that's social scoring, whether that's kind of making decisions, algorithmic management around who is hired, who's not, based on, swathes of unfair already existing data that reflects that. My question then would be, so the first one is around the definition. And I appreciate you saying that the language matters, because it does. And one thing that's happened in this negotiation space is whether it's trying to address all the things that AI would be or could be or has been or ex ante exposed to all these things, right? On the one hand, the definition on the one hand, the definition. Because if you don't say something that potentially could be AI, does that mean it's not going to be in the risk categorization list whatsoever? And that's dangerous. And now they have something on the kind of all-purpose AI. Yeah. So that means I can go to the pound store and just buy a kind of a little AI off the shelf. And I'm kind of like excited to see what it's going to look like. Yeah, that's it. And then, sorry, I won't say too much more because there's 2 major ones. One's the definition. You might have noticed that last week, the Council of Europe have come up with, because in Annex 3, they're actually discussing taking out from the high risk list. You know this already, right? And they have to do with deepfake detection. They have to do with crime analytics, and they have to do with, again, this very intensive kind of bits of the kind of stuff that we're not necessarily instantly saying exists and necessary for like the labor side. But one thing that the legislators and the MEPs have been saying constantly when we're going through the amendments phase, when we say, what's this mean for workers? They say, go to see GDPR, see local labor law. This is horizontal. So that for me is potentially quite high problematic. Okay, final thing on the liability. Second one, liability, because the machinery directive already has within it lots of liability. Here's the problem. This is all I'm going to say. AI is not only a product. AI is a service. Okay, that's where we come against where the definition becomes so difficult and the liability becomes so difficult. Final thing, they have the new directive discussion on the proposal for in AI specifically, one to keep an eye on, right? And this, I mean, I just feel like regulation's only like a teeny little step. And if you wanted to see what we're working on, we've got the report out from the ILO thingy. It's online and stuff like that, or just about to be online in our launch thingy. But we have to keep this discussion going because it's especially in the workers space.
I'll just pick up. I'll just pick up. So the reason why it's so broad is because they don't want to miss out on anything. So all of the criticism is coming from industry and saying it's too broad. But yeah, but at the moment it's more on the, let's say if you want to portray it as a rights versus industry debate, rights are winning, like dramatically winning on this in terms of the definition of AI. People are pushing for it to be way more narrow. So at the moment, actually, it's so vast that it captures the Excel sheet, as Frida was mentioning. So on that sense, we're in sense, if the motive is the human rights concern, it's the human rights team is winning, on that sense. I think, yeah, sure. I think the other area is, and this is a much broader question, and I'll throw it to you, Abby, is what is the role of regulation? So a broader question is that this is coming for companies. We can guarantee that you're going to have compliance concerns, and it's going to, you have to manage this. But there's a broader question about, does it solve at the core the problem? So in GDPR, did GDPR solve the problem of privacy? I don't think anybody is going to seriously say yes. Yeah. So I don't. So we should be. We are talking about regulation, but just to kind of, if you will dangle it, I don't think the AI Act is going to solve the problem of ethical automation.
I don't know if I feel qualified to answer that question. So thanks, Emre. But I suppose as a BEM, overemphasizing the role of the law becomes necessary when the other architectures for a balance of power aren't in place. And I suppose in a UK context, when we think specifically about the workplace, some of those historic mechanisms for balance of interests and powers being negotiated aren't necessarily as present. And it's interesting that there are models in the rest of Europe for how that might be done instead. But I suppose regulation becomes even more important in that context. So I'll just leave it at that.
Nice. No, you can see the microphone. There's a question online. Can you put it up so I can definitely see? I think it's from Tom. So Tom Cornell. People can now opt out of automated decision making, but how often would they have opt-outs of human decision making? If we would know more about that human's ability to make that decision, which is a good point. Do you feel there is a certain irony that AI systems are being increasingly held to higher standard than human systems? And yeah, like that's a great question. Who wanna go for it?
Well, I suppose I think this is this comes back to Emre's first call for whether or not this is going to be a source of social transformation or not. The codification of social logics, if they are made transparent and we can see what the rules of the game are in various contexts, that would be a progressive thing. I think that the point made about whether or not you would have been able to opt out of a person's specific kind of ability kind of reflects that idea of bias that we were talking about earlier. But often these kind of problems are in more of a systemic nature. So I did think that it's interesting that the regulation is sort of suggesting that you can opt out. I can't see how that would, there's this idea of a dichotomy in different forms of agency between voice and exit. And in the market, you conventionally can exit because you just choose to use you consume a different type of burger. In a work, or whatever it is, in a workplace, voice is important because we don't have the choice not to work. So what is this ability to opt out? Is it to, leave the company? I mean, unless we have protections that mean that, so I suppose, yeah, I think it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. Let's hear from Frida.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So it kind of makes me think of this example of sentencing guidelines that we have in the US. And I think there was a study showing that when a judge was sentencing somebody, they often gave out longer sentences after lunch. It was something like really ridiculous that, there was so much discretion that the judge. Sorry?
It was before lunch.
It was before lunch. But there are also algorithms that are designed to help judges make decisions. And, those have the potential to really be incredibly helpful. But there are also algorithms that, weren't appropriately vetted and used historical data that was biased, where judges had more of a tendency, controlling for other factors to give African Americans longer sentences. And that obviously has the potential to do incredible harm, especially if we're then using that algorithm to make, more quicker and a higher higher volume of decisions around sentencing. So, I mean, absolutely, there's bias in, you know, both cases potentially, but I think, you know, if done properly and with the accountability and transparency that these laws are requiring, algorithms can be incredibly helpful and have some really cool societal benefits.
Nice. I'm open for a final question from the audience here. Anyone has a final question? Can you just get the microphone to him, please? Yeah. Can you also introduce yourself?
Jason Devereaux, Head of People Sciences at Barclays International. So our role is to try and see how we can best deploy algorithms to optimize human capital, the workforce, experience, efficiencies, the whole 9 yards. Very experimental. But when we start by looking at the human factors, knowledge base regarding human decision bias and the incidents it leads to, you know, bringing down a perfectly normal airplane, oil and gas explosions of the Gulf of Mexico, nuclear power incidents, we really have to challenge ourselves and think actually, is AI a tool to serve for the better good? Or do we get really too involved here in the human rights issue without thinking at the possibilities of huge environmental disasters and so forth by not using it? We know humans are designed to err. Anyone who's done a master's degree in human factors or ergonomics would have learned that in the first week. How can we get the humans and the AI to work in harmony, perfect optimization? It's the human-computer interaction where sort of cognitive engineering is now going to, because humans on their own, really bad. AI alone probably could do a better job in most instances if supervised properly, but it's that interaction between the two. It's the triad with the human technology and the work system that we need the right tools, that we need the right frameworks to start testing and experimenting, not just in research, I used to be an academic, but also in organizations, and not punishing for trying and failing. We've got to try and learn and share that industry knowledge collectively. That's my point of view, but it'd be really interesting to hear.
Nice.
The panel, I missed the first half, so I'm really sorry, but it's really an interesting area.
Nice. Would you like to make a comment, Emre?
Sure, yeah. So actually, before you came, we were just talking about how ironic it was that the reason we were bemoaning the injustices of algorithms is because they were revealed to be biased or unfair. And the reason they were shown is because they were algorithmic. And we were just saying, it's just got example after example. And sometimes I completely agree. You know, you've just got so many examples. So was it going to be the case that those people being sentenced in the example Frida gave were not going to be sentenced in a horribly biased way? Was recruitment or was fair prior to algorithmic use? I think the area that I am concerned about, the ethical question, is amplification of risk, the ability to do a significant amount of damage very quickly. So that's where, if you will, the controls and the safety, I think, is very, very important, and not to just augment existing biases. But I completely agree. I see algorithms as a massive opportunity. And it's really in that interface between the algorithms and the actual humans and the use of that technology that I think is the most nuanced and interesting part of this whole discussion.
Yeah. Can I make a final question? And that's because I'm very curious, because we got a data protection person, we got a AI ethics person here, we got a more kind of label human rights person here. So the question that I usually have is the intersection or the interrelationship between data and AI. Frida probably knows GDPR pretty well. There is stuff in GDPR and also in the CCPA that touches an AI. It's almost like it's necessary to talk about data processing in some way, and they have to talk about AI as a good form of, interesting form at least, of data processing happening. I have a lot of questions about this relationship, but I'm curious to know, for example, is the data protection people, for example, in the companies, are they going to be the ones responsible for AI as well? Or we're thinking about, for example, a new profession? That's one question that I have. And then if I can put a second question is how is going to be the giving of the two legislations. And Emre knows what I mean by that. The trade-off between privacy and bias is going to be quite an interesting case. Can you, all of you, comment, if possible, Emre, with the trade-off between data and privacy?
Sure. So very, very early on, when we were speculating about this with our academic hats on, we thought that probably because the last decade was very much defined by data and data governance, and we've had this huge regulatory intervention in the form of GDPR, we thought the path dependency would have just been that AI would have just sat on top of data governance and data protection. So let me say from a legislative, let's say from a legal perspective, turned out it wasn't actually like that. So I think it was Article 22 that was focused in GDPR, that was focused on innovative technologies and machine learning even, but a whole body of case law didn't actually emerge. And secondly, and probably more interestingly, from a conceptual perspective, it looked like the value that was underpinning the concern in GDPR was privacy, protection of privacy. And it looks to us like a lot of the motivating value, the foundational value that motivates lots of the concerns regarding AI is fairness. And when we were looking at this, we were saying, well, there is lots and lots of ways in which when we do bias assessment, if you will, we're interested in how the systems are performing against different demographics. Ergo, it requires us analyzing, collecting, if you will, exactly the kind of data that your privacy intuitions will suggest that you shouldn't. So we don't believe, I don't think anyone seriously believes in fairness through ignorance or fairness through cloaking. Turns out when you actually do have the data and you assess it, it surfaces all these horrible things. So it looks like prima facie, but it's just kind of academic discussion, that there's a trade-off between privacy and fairness. And we're seeing it played out actually in the New York City legislation.
Nice. Frida.
Yeah, I can jump in on a different aspect of where I think that, algorithmic accountability and data intersect. And that's that there's been a ton of issues regarding sourcing data to actually train and test your algorithms. And we've seen a couple of enforcement actions from the Federal Trade Commission, which has really broad authority to enforce, various laws, including their unfair and deceptive act and practice against companies. And we've seen a couple of cases where they've required algorithmic disgorgement, meaning that if you used data you didn't have rights over to train your algorithm, the FTC has required those companies to destroy that algorithm. And these cases have typically come up where there's some sensitive data collection that's been involved. So if the company is collecting children's data and they didn't get consent as required under federal law, or where the company is collecting data and either they didn't get consent to it, like biometric information, or they misled consumers about how they were going to use the data. And those consumers didn't know that that data was being used to train a large facial recognition model. So it can be really detrimental and really company ending for a company to be subject to an enforcement action like this, where they're required to actually destroy the underlying algorithm, not to mention obviously reputational issues associated with those types of enforcement actions. So I think to answer one of your earlier questions, Adriano, the data privacy folks are going to have to work really closely with the engineers. And I think remains to be seen whether there's going to be a specific specialty area for folks in-house to be focusing on algorithms. I mean, certainly there are at the large tech companies, but definitely the privacy world has grown exponentially in the last few years. And that's driven in part because of these types of enforcement actions and the laws that we've been discussing today.
Abi?
I suppose I want to start by just picking up a little bit on your point. And I think that's what's really important when we think about the adoption of these systems is identifying, especially when they relate to people, how they're going to generate value. And this was something that I mentioned at the beginning, but just to pick it up again, as you missed it, and elaborate on it a little bit. Identifying the difference between where something is substituting for a role, so the work is displaced, between where it's intensifying work that's of a worker, where it might be high discretion augmentation where they get to use more skills, or low discretion augmentation where they aren't able to use as many skills and therefore they can be priced at a lower rate or something. and just different forms of wage management. When you think about the introduction of these systems to replace managerial human decision-making, designing how an organization works, these are profound choices about what a business is going to be, not just in the way that you create value, but also in the way that people will relate to each other for 35 hours a week if they do get to relate to each other at all. So if you're beginning to automate, management as a function, as a business, which is, I think, the thing that most of this regulation is responding to, which is the sharp end of the wedge, so to speak, with this stuff, rather than all these incredibly useful use cases, in which case it would be substituting for human roles, which is a slightly different question from some of these other risks. It does make sense to have teams that are integrated ranging from, because when you think about what those decisions are about the design of jobs, your compliance with different regulations, what human relations looks like. The team of people should be beyond the data protection officer, human relations staff, health and safety officers, the legal team, procurement team. And in responsible organizations, they're already bringing those kind of folks together to think about this and recognizing that actually when you come down to asking, is it logical to use scanned items on a till as a performance construct, then it's not that complicated. Like these questions are political at the end of the day. We need to decode what those political choices are about the design of decisions. And maybe that takes a little bit of a conversation with some of the techie folks, but it should definitely be led by that wider set of infrastructures around work design.
Nice. We can stay in the microphone. I guess, I think I'll close now. I just want to thank all the speakers for the amazing session. Thank all the attendees as well for the questions. Thanks the team from marketing, has been amazing. Sam, Joe, Stan, amazing work to put up this whole event together. Thanks Frida as well for to be part of the panel. I think this discussion about responsible people analytics is going to be a discussion that will keep coming over and over and over. I believe that I would say probably for the next year onwards, this is going to become one of those major topics. Yeah, keep tuning in. We have plenty of more events coming for the next season. And thank you very much for attending and joining us online. Cheers. Now we finally go for the networking drinks. Bye-bye, all people online. Bye, Frida.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.